Yeah, there's a reality. You've got to figure it out, and you've got to be careful. You're not just a floating, disembodied, platonic awareness. He says at 6 minutes and 18 seconds, prove that the material universe exists. You can't. Tell you what, if I were a violent, mean, cruel person, I would try to find him and throw him off of a building and tell me when you're done falling on the pavement down there that there's not an objective reality. Somebody said that people like David Hume, these eternal skeptics, and like this moron Prodigy, the Prodigy 2186, these morons like David Hume and such, they all walk around doubting everything and saying we can't know, we can't know, we can't know, but they're very careful not to step in front of buses and such, or in the case of Hume, in front of horse and carriages and stuff. Very careful about that, even though they say we can never know that there's a real reality and stuff. Lame, lame, lame. Fail. 6 minutes and 30 seconds, he says, this is where I lose them, this is the part where they get lost. He's about to give his really good argument, I guess. I'll just say real quick, he is already really lost. And he says he's trying not to make assumptions, but you don't have to assume the existence of reality. I revisit the point. It's not an assumption you have to make. It simply is there. You perceive it, and it's real. Now he says something fairly hilarious at around 7 minutes and 15 seconds. He says, I'm with people as far as assuming that in order to live your day-to-day life, you have to assume that the material universe exists in order to go about living, right? Okay, why is that not proof that there is a material universe then? He says that it's an assumption. That's the problem with this. We assume it. We don't really know that there's an independent objective reality. We just assume it so that we can go about our daily lives. And then he says, if we're going to be philosophers, 7 minutes 25 seconds, if we're going to be philosophers, then we can't make this assumption. We don't need this assumption. We shouldn't make this assumption. Again, it is not an assumption. It is not. You're not assuming that the world exists. You perceive it. You know it exists through your sense organs, which do not deceive you the way Kant said. They simply give you the information of reality, which you then have to figure out. They do not deceive or filter or disorient the information in any way. They give it to you exactly, perfectly as they receive it. Your eyeballs give you exactly what they get from the world. And if your eyeball is not functioning correctly, then like mine aren't when I don't have glasses on, then you might have to figure out scientifically what exactly is the difference between what your eye is perceiving and what's out there in the real world. And you have to figure out how to make things like eyeglasses to fix that. But you wouldn't be able to even consider that question if there weren't some objective reality to measure it against and go and say, okay, have we fixed this eyeball yet? This eyeball was slightly broken. Have we fixed it now by putting these glasses in front of it? You have to have an objective independent reality to measure it against, to do anything at all. At 7 minutes and 40 seconds, he says, atheists make several huge assumptions, and he's going to enumerate a couple of them. Assumption number one, he says, is that there exists a world of material objects. He's willing to go so far as to say, yeah, we can assume that to walk around in our day-to-day lives, but we can't assume it as philosophers. Philosophers should be more practical. No, that assumption is not an assumption. It is simply an objective truth that you can get through your sense organs. He says it's an assumption that statements about these objects can be known through sense perception. No, we didn't assume that. We tested it, and we found it to be true. We can know about the objective world out there through our sense organs, and I might add, through absolutely nothing else. There is no other way to obtain information about the world. None at all. And we don't assume that we're able to know things about the world. we have found things out about the world, and therefore we know that we can know things about the world. And a 2 or a 3-year-old has a better understanding, it seems, than Prodigy 2186. A 2 or a 3-year-old knows that they drop a block, it's gonna fall. They don't just assume that it's going to fall and keep on assuming that their whole life. They know it's going to fall. They've experienced it. It is an objective world that's reliable and that you can test. It's not an assumption, but this guy is irritating. Another assumption, he says, the atheists make is that these objects in the world exist not only when they're being perceived, but also when they're not being perceived. That's rather odd. Yes, that's true. Things do exist when they're not being perceived. For example, before life arose on the earth, there were stars and stuff. No one was there perceiving it, unless you're going to say God had to perceive it. And he says the atheists assume that these objects in the world have their same properties whether we're perceiving them or not. He says that's an assumption. No, it's not an assumption. It's knowledge. For example, it doesn't matter whether we're looking at the moon or not. Right? It's got a gravitational effect on the tide. And if we go to bed, get up the next day, and go out, oh look, the tides are still doing their thing. Even though I wasn't looking at the moon, it continued to affect the world. And even though it's on the other side of the world right now, it's affecting the world, even though I can't see it. I could give 1,000 examples, but I think the best one is about a little kid with a block and dropping it and stuff. That's not an assumption, that's knowledge. Knowledge is different from wild assertions and assumptions. Knowledge means you know something true about the world. At 8 minutes and 28 seconds, he says, it's an assumption that we perceive the world directly with our senses as it is. We perceive the world as it is. This is an assumption. Well, if you have any evidence that your perceptions are off, for example, I have evidence that my perceptions are not quite correct when I'm not wearing my glasses, because I know that trees are not nebulous blobs of green. I know that they're made of sticks and leaves, because I've actually touched them and seen them. So, when I look at a tree and it's all blurry in a nebulous blob, I know that there's something going on with my perception. Now, that doesn't mean that my perception is always and forever in doubt. That just means that my perception needs to be corrected in some way, in this case, to come into accordance with reality. I know there's a reality out there, I know that I'm perceiving it, and I know that in order for me to act correctly in reality, I have to perceive it correctly. Therefore, eyeglasses. It's as simple as that. And he says that that's just an assumption that there's an independent reality that we perceive and that we can know about. It's not an assumption, it's right here. It's right here. 8 minutes and 50 seconds. He says these assumptions, as atheists make, ignore the fact that there's a filter of our sensory organs between us and reality. And like I was saying earlier, it's not a filter. It gives you exactly what reality is. And to the extent that it doesn't, we can investigate, find that out, and usually correct it. I don't know if they can correct color blindness. I'm pretty sure they can. But we don't know about color blindness because of a Platonic nebulous gargoyle that told us. We know about it through our perceptions of the real world. And he says that our senses stop us from directly perceiving reality. No, they don't. Our perception is a direct perception of reality. It doesn't get in between us and reality. How would you ever access reality without sensory input? Plato maybe could do it with pure thinking, but Plato was a moron. And then he says this is called naive realism. Naives, well, it'll have to be brought up in composure, in status, if we're going to go with that. But no, that's just a bad name given to it by idiots and morons and college professors. Naive realism's not what it is. It is actually realism, perhaps, or objectivity.